Hey there, ready to dive into this research on language and thought you sent our way? This one's got me really curious, have to say. Seems like you're fascinated by how those two connect language and thought, I mean. And that's a question that's been kicking around for centuries, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher and a fascinating one. You've given us a lot to unpack here: linguistics, psychology, even some neuroscience. It's amazing. With this material, we can really dig into not just how language works, but how it might actually be shaping the way we experience the world.
Okay, so before we get too far, let's break it down a bit. We use the word language all the time, but what are we really talking about when we talk about how it works?
Well, one paper you provided calls language a rule-governed symbol system. Sounds a bit jargony, I know, but think of it like building with Legos.
Okay, I can always get behind a good Lego analogy.
Right. So you've got your individual pieces, the symbols, like the sounds in a language, even those click consonants in some Southern African languages, those are like Lego bricks too,
Hmm.
or letters, gestures, you name it. And then you've got the rules for putting those pieces together, your grammar. That's what lets us take a limited set of pieces and create a zillion different structures, just like you can communicate endless ideas with language.
So we're taking those Lego bricks, putting them together in different ways, but it's not just about randomly throwing words together, is it? There's a structure to all of this.
You got it. One of the articles described it as a hierarchy, which really clicked for me. At the bottom, you have phonemes. Those are like the smallest units of sound, like the coo sound in cat.
Okay.
Then you move up a level to morphemes. Those are the smallest units of meaning. So cat itself would be a morpheme. Or the ing in running.
So we're combining those sounds into meaningful units.
And it builds from there. You go from morphemes to words to phrases to sentences. And then ultimately to discourse, how we string sentences together, to tell stories, have conversations, even write research papers like the ones you sent. It all builds up.
That's incredible. So we've got the building blocks, the hierarchy, but how does our brain actually make sense of it all? Because most of the time, it feels effortless.
That's the million-dollar question. Your sources talk about two main processes: bottom-up and top-down processing. Imagine reading a text message. I'm sure you do plenty of that.
You know it.
So bottom-up is like carefully looking at each letter and word on the screen, one by one. But top-down, that's where it gets really interesting. That's your brain using everything it already knows. Like its knowledge of English, the context of the conversation, even your friend's texting style, to guess what's coming next.
So it's like our brains are filling in the blanks based on what they already know.
Exactly. And one of your sources illustrates this perfectly with the Stroop effect. Ever heard of that one? It's where you have to name the color of a word, but the word itself spells a different color, like the word blue written in red ink.
Oh, yeah. I've tried that online, way harder than it looks.
That's because reading has become so automatic for us. Our brains can't help but read the word even when we're supposed to focus on something else.
It's like our brains are working against us in that case.
In a way, yeah. But it shows you how powerful that top-down processing can be.
So this is all happening because of specific areas in our brains, right? I
Mhm.
remember seeing Broca's area and Wernicke's area in the research. Those sounded important.
They are. Think of Broca's area like the speech production center. Its job is to put sentences together correctly and get those words out. And then there's Wernicke's area, which is all about comprehension, understanding what those words actually mean.
So if one of those areas is damaged, like Broca's or Wernicke's, that could really mess things up, right?
It can be devastating. One of the papers mentioned aphasia, that's a disorder that affects language processing. And it talked about how people with damage to Broca's area, they can usually understand language fine, but they struggle to actually speak it fluently.
Like they know what they want to say, but they just can't get it out.
Exactly. And it can be so frustrating for them, understandably. Then you've got cases where damage to Wernicke's area leads to what they call fluent aphasia. And that's where people can speak easily, but their words are jumbled or their sentences are grammatically incorrect. They might even use made-up words without realizing it.
Wow. So it's fluent, but it doesn't make much sense.
Ugh.
That's incredible. It really shows how complex language processing is, you know? Makes you wonder how babies even start to figure it all out.
Right. It's mind-blowing how quickly they go from gurgling to having full-blown conversations. One of the studies talked about how between the ages of 2 and 6, kids learn an average of 10 new words every day.
10 a day. I'm lucky if I learn one new word a week.
I hear that. And it's not just about memorizing words either. They're figuring out grammar, the subtle nuances of language. It seems like our brains are kind of hardwired for it, and part of that might come from how adults talk to babies.
You mean like parentese, that sing-songy voice?
Exactly. One study looked at parentese across different cultures, and it turns out that higher pitch, the slower tempo, it's not just for our own amusement, it actually helps babies learn.
So without even realizing it, we're giving them these little language lessons from the very beginning. What about animals, though? Can they learn language, or is that something only humans can do?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? You included a fascinating study on kanzi, the bonobo who learned to communicate with lexicograms, those symbols that represent words.
Oh yeah, I remember reading about Kabzi. They were putting these symbols together to ask for things or talk about objects that weren't even in the room. It seemed really advanced.
It really was impressive, and it definitely challenges some of what we used to think about animal communication. Studies like Kanzi's raise some big questions about what language really is.
Yeah, like where do we draw the line?
Yeah.
When does communication become complex enough to be called language?
Exactly. And that ties into the linguistic relativity hypothesis, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Remember that one?
Right. That's the idea that the language we speak could actually be shaping how we think.
Which is kind of mind-blowing if you think about it. The research you sent, it talked about one study where they looked at how people who speak different languages performed on these tasks where they had to categorize objects. And what they found was that people were more likely to group objects together if their language actually had a word for that category.
Interesting. So if your language has a word for it, you're more likely to see it as its own distinct thing.
It seems that way. And it suggests that language isn't just a tool for expressing thought, but it might be influencing thought itself.
Wow. So we can think in words.
Yeah.
But what about thinking without words, like when you're daydreaming or trying to picture how to solve a problem?
Good point. Language is just one aspect of thought. One of the papers you sent talked about different types of thinking. Like, there's propositional thought that's basically thinking in statements, like, that cloud looks like a dog.
Okay.
And then there's imaginal thought that's more about creating a mental picture in your mind, like actually picturing that fluffy cloud dog.
Oh, I do that all the time, especially when I'm trying to remember where I left my keys. I try to picture myself going through my day.
There you go. Imaginal thought in action. And then you've got motoric thought, which is like mentally rehearsing action. So like picturing yourself hitting that perfect tennis serve or whatever your sport is.
Hold on. So you're saying just thinking about throwing a ball, it activates some of the same areas in your brain as actually throwing one.
Yeah, it's wild. And it just goes to show how powerful our brains are that can simulate entire experiences, which is super useful for learning new stuff or planning for the future.
That's incredible. So we've got these different ways of thinking,
Yeah.
but what about when we're trying to solve problems? Are there certain ways our brains go about doing that?
Well, your sources had some interesting stuff on that. They talked about how we often rely on what are called heuristics.
Heuristics. Aren't those like mental shortcuts?
You got it. They're like rules of thumb, educated guesses that help us make quicker decisions, especially when we don't have all the information. Imagine you're trying to pick a restaurant, right? You might be drawn to the one with the longest line, assuming that means the food's good.
Makes sense. A long line is usually a good sign, but those shortcuts don't always work out, do they?
That's the thing. One paper gave the example of the availability heuristic. Like, if you've been on a true crime kick and you just watched a bunch of documentaries about plane crashes, you might suddenly feel like flying is super dangerous, even though statistically it's one of the safest ways to travel.
Because our brains latch on to those vivid examples, even if they're not really accurate overall.
Exactly. And that's just one. Then you've got confirmation bias. That's our tendency to seek out information that confirms what we already believe, even if it means ignoring stuff that contradicts it.
Oh, yeah. I think we've all been guilty of that one at some point.
We're all human. And then there are framing effects. How the way information is presented can actually change our choices.
Okay, how does that work? Give me an example.
So in one of your sources, there's this study where people were given different options for dealing with like a hypothetical disease outbreak, right? And when the options were framed in terms of how many lives would be saved, people went for the more certain option, even if it meant maybe fewer lives saved overall. But get this, when those same options were presented in terms of how many lives would be lost.
People were more willing to take a risk.
Exactly. Wild, right?
Yeah. It really shows how, even though we think we're being rational, all of these other things are affecting our choices.
Totally. It's pretty amazing when you think about it.
It makes you realize how important it is to, like, pay attention to those things, to really examine why we make the choices we do, This whole deep dive has me looking at things differently already. Like, remember when we were talking about those different types of thinking, and you mentioned motoric thought, mentally rehearsing actions?
Right, right. Like picturing yourself making that perfect golf swing or whatever it is you
Yeah,
do.
exactly. Well, one of their papers talked about a study where they had people mentally rotate objects, kind of like those brain teaser puzzles.
Yeah.
And they found that the time it took someone to mentally rotate the object matched up with how long it would actually take to physically rotate it.
Wow. So it's like our brains are working with an actual model in those moments, almost like we're really interacting with the object.
It's crazy. So
Yeah.
we have these mental images, we're running simulations, and it all comes back to this idea that our thoughts, they have a real impact on how we interact with the world.
It makes you wonder if our thoughts can be so closely linked to our physical actions. Where's the line between the two? It's a question that kind of blurs the lines between psychology and neuroscience. Even philosophy gets in there.
It really does. This is giving me a lot to think about. So after all this research, what would you say is the biggest takeaway for our listener?
That's a good question. I think the most important thing is just remembering that language and thought are totally connected. They influence each other in ways we're only just starting to understand.
It's like that saying, we shape our tools, and then our tools shape us. But the tools in this case are the words we use and the thoughts we think.
Ooh, I like that. And understanding how those tools work, how they can be affected by bias or these framing effects we talked about that can help us be better communicators and more critical thinkers.
So it's about being more self-aware, more questioning of our own assumptions.
Exactly. Because when we understand how our minds work, that's when we can really unlock their potential.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This has been an awesome journey exploring language and thought. We've covered so much, those basic building blocks of language, the complexities of decision-making. It's amazing to think how much is going on under the surface of every conversation, every single thought we have.
It's pretty incredible when you think about it. It's been great exploring this stuff anew.
And for everyone listening, we'll leave you with this. If the language we speak can actually shape our thoughts, what might be possible if we try learning a new language? Or exploring a new culture? Or even just challenging our own assumptions? Just something to think about as you go about your day. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been a great conversation.